All right, well, welcome to week 2 of small groups. Today we're covering James chapter 3. A couple weeks ago, we started with our James kickoff, and you can find Tom's talk through the book of James on our YouTube page. There we covered chapter 1. Last week we covered chapter 2. In chapter 1, you'll have noted that we saw 5 themes that are introduced in chapter 1 that you find throughout the book of James. Chapter 2 had 2 of those. It talked about being doers of the word and also about riches. And here in chapter 3, we're going to see 2 more. We're going to see the topic of the tongue, which is a major theme in James, and then also of wisdom. And that'll be as we get to the end of it. At this point, if you have not already, pause this video and read through that chapter in its entirety together and then join us back here. We're going to go ahead and jump into it. You'll have noticed that in this first section, verses 1 through, I'm looking at verse 12, is this first theme is the theme of the tongue. And it's littered with images. You have the image of a bit and bridle. You have a ship's rudder, a forest fire, salt and fresh water. All this is here to illustrate that the tongue is something that is impossible to constrain. The tongue demonstrates that all of your self-help to try to fix yourself is completely undone by the tongue. You can have yourself all together, and then this little rudder will undo the whole thing. So the image of bit and bridle, look at verse 3. It shows that the tongue guides the whole body, which is why this teaching is so important for teachers, because they're the people who use their mouths, use their words. And what he's showing us is that our words affect Christ's body, the church, more than anything else we do. And then look at that next one in verse 4. It's the image of a ship's rudder. James is showing that we can't help ourselves because even this little rudder will redirect an entire ship off course when it's on course. And then look at verses 5 and 6, especially the second half of verse 5. You start seeing the image of a forest fire, that taming the tongue is as difficult as taming a forest fire on your own. He says that this fire spreads even among the church, and in his words, it stains the whole body. This shows that your individual sin doesn't just affect you, it affects those around you. It affects the whole body. James says that we can tame all sorts of animals in the sea, on land, and in the air, but you can't tame the tongue. Not so with the tongue. Taming the tongue is not in our ability, which is why I think he chooses this next illustration to get his point across. In verses 11 and 12, you see him pull up this image of salt water and fresh water. And one doesn't quickly just change to the other. In some translations, you'll note that he uses the word bitter or sweet. He'll say bitter water or sweet water. It's because he's not actually using quite this normal word that you use for salt in the ancient Near East. He's using a word that refers more to the bitterness of salt. Sometimes you'll be seeing it in the Bible to describe people. And here, he is describing the bitterness of what can come out of our mouths. So you have this image of salt water and fresh water. I don't know if you've ever been in the ocean and then you get out and maybe you had a mouthful of fresh water because you weren't able to get up on the surfboard or something that sounds a bit like me here. I'm not even going to try it. But you get out and you open your water bottle and you taste it, and your regular water suddenly tastes sweet. And I think that's kind of the image here, what's going on. And the question we have in front of us is, how do we change from this bitter saltiness in our souls to the sweetness of the Spirit? Well, we'll be getting into that in some of our questions, especially as you look into John. So pay attention there. I did want to give y'all kind of an image for why it's so important that in the ancient Near East, and even today, it's not necessarily all the way back then, that your water source is good is especially important. So part of my studies, I got to do some archaeology in Jordan. A friend of mine, who's one of my old professors, kept inviting me back for reasons I don't know. But I got to go out there and we would dig. We were working on this old basilica. It was gorgeous. I'd love to tell you all about it sometime. But one of the things we did is we went on a little field trip because Dave wanted us to see this town and learn a little bit about it. And we drove into this valley, and there's nothing around. It's very barren, very dry. Most of the hill is kind of dirt and rock with some kind of deserty shrubs here and there. But in the valley, there were all of these trucks that had kind of created this circle, and it was around a hole. It had been converted into a manhole, but it was a natural hole that when we climbed down into it, we could fit about 3 of us down in there. It was their source of water. And what had been carved out was this cave, and it was from this little stream of water, probably 6 inches wide, no more than 3 inches deep. And these trucks had these pipes that were going down into the hole, and there's a guy down there, and he was pulling in, he was sucking in the water into his pipe, and it was being pumped up to the truck. And that was the source of water for the entire town. That little bit of water. And they didn't have trucks back then to go get it. They were often going to wells. You'll see in John chapter 4 the image of a woman at the well. And it was incredibly important that water source was good. So how much more that the source of all of our works within us, and we hope that they're good, is a good source, that it's not bitter. And that's the question we're going to wrestle with a little bit today. Also wanted to admonish y'all as y'all begin to talk to one another. I think one of the things that James has to say for us is that we don't use bitter words with each other, but sweet words. And I know that can be hard, especially as you know people in the church and have known them for a long time. People hurt us, and it's hard not to speak these bitter words. But when we have a new source of life within us, when we have the Spirit, suddenly we find this new source of fresh water bubbling up that we can love even those who hurt us. So I want to give you that admonition. And on this topic of keeping peace in the church, I think that leads us to the next topic, which we see in James. Looking in verse 13, James says, "Who is wise and understanding among you?" You see, this is introducing a new theme of wisdom. He's on to a new theme, so follow along in your Bibles. He's talking about the biblical theme of wisdom. And that looks very different from what we see in the Old Testament. Excuse me, not in the Old Testament, in the world is what I meant to say. It looks very different from what we see in the world. Looks very similar to what we see in the Old Testament. What we see in the world is people who prize ambition, intellect, strength, power. That is what this image of not necessarily a wise, but the kind of people we want to be like. And maybe wisdom is wit or something like that. But James knows that Jesus, he values something different. Jesus values gentleness and meekness. Meekness is certainly not something that we usually associate with wisdom. It's reluctant to speak. It's quiet. It's still. But Jesus said the meek will inherit the earth. In verse 13, James asks the people who think they are wise to step forward. But the kind of person who would consider themselves wise immediately disqualifies themselves from Jesus's kind of wisdom. That kind of wisdom, verse 15 says, is earthly. But heavenly wisdom is found in gentle people. Verse 14 might be a bit confusing in some of your translations. I'm using the NRSV, and it's a bit confusing in that one. But what it says really is pretty simple. It's saying that if you are envious and selfish, be honest with yourself about it. The two words he uses there are interesting: bitter envy and selfish ambition. That word bitter is the same word that he was using to describe saltiness earlier. So it's kind of this salty ambition or salty envy. But then we also have the second one of selfish ambition. That was a word used back then to describe people who were self-interested. Aristotle used it once to describe politicians who sought public office not for the public good, but for their own gain. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but I see it. In verse 16, you'll see that he describes these two things again, this kind of salty envy and selfish ambition. And he says, there, when you see those two things, you'll find a disordered community. And the church isn't meant to be like that at all. Here's what the church is supposed to be like. Look at verse 17. It's supposed to be, first of all, pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality and hypocrisy. And James says, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Verse 18 says that those who are peacemakers and sow peace into their community will reap a harvest of righteousness, because that's how God's righteousness is accomplished, through peacemaking. Well, wish you all the best in your discussion. Remember to read the passage and to answer each of these three questions. At the end, pray together. I have some suggestions in there. I think going in a circle and praying for one another is a great way to be a church together. Well, thank you all, and best with your discussion.